This is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian.
And now, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream, Chapter 16. The train station was deserted at this time of night, the only sound being the mournful rush of wind whistling through the girders of the tin roof. In the distance, a signal bell clanged, and moments later a solitary train pulled up to the platform, with the creak of ancient carriages. Jacob raced down the steps 3 at a time. "Come on, we've got to get out of here," he yelled. Ella puffed down the steps behind him. "We have to go back!" "There's no time." Jacob reached the bottom of the stairs and grabbed hold of the rail, spinning himself down onto the platform. "He'll kill us all!" "Slow down, both of you!" Jen ran down the steps behind them, closely followed by Henry. Dr. Spencer brought up the rear, her auburn hair flying. The 5 of them reached the bottom of the stairs and ran across the platform to the waiting train. Jacob pounded on the door release button, almost dancing with impatience. After an agonizingly long delay, the doors hissed open and they ran inside. The carriage was empty, but Jacob ran down the aisle into the next car, then the next, getting as far away from the platform as he possibly could. Finally, he reached the end of the train by the driver's cab and collapsed into a seat, craning his neck to peer anxiously out the window. The platform was empty. A moment later, the train gave an arthritic creak and began moving, shuffling out of the station with a belligerent clang of bells. Jacob buried his head in his hands. "He's here. How can he be here? It wasn't supposed to work that way." "What wasn't supposed to work that way, Jacob?" Ella asked. "The plan. Oh, God, there was a plan. Kane was supposed to... He wanted me to... Oh, God, what has he done?" "So that was the late, great Frederick Krueger, I'm presuming," said Dr. Spencer wryly. Jacob nodded dumbly. "Well, I don't see what all the fuss was about," said Henry, putting his feet up on the seat opposite. "He looked fairly normal to me. Hat, check. Christmas sweater, check. Huge razor knives attached to creepy gardening gloves, check, check." He shrugged. "Obviously, he's a stand-up citizen." "How did he find us?" said Jen, her eyes wide with fear. It was all Kane's idea," said Jacob, shaking his head. "He used me to lure him out, to summon him. He wanted to strip him of his powers and trap his spirit in this death stone. But something went wrong. It must have gone wrong." He sat forward in his seat, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "Kane must have been interrupted. Then when I released all that dream power, Freddy's spirit went into Kane." Jacob swallowed, feeling bile rise in his throat. "The way he killed those 3 cops. They shouldn't have fired on him like that. Bullets only make him mad. Oh, God, they're going to lock me up for life for this. Oh, my God." "Would someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" cried Jen. "Are you all on drugs? What's a death stone? And I thought that Freddy guy was supposed to be dead." "He is," said Jacob, "but Kane brought him back. We had a plan. There was a plan." "Yeah, great plan, buddy," snapped Henry. "Resurrect the homicidal maniac and stand around screaming like a baby, check, 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 while he butchers 3 very nice policemen and a little girl in cold blood, check, 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 check. And you let that one off the drawing board. Why, exactly?" "I told you. It wasn't meant to go like that. I thought we were helping. Yeah, just like you helped that little girl, said Henry, leaving her behind like that. We could have taken Freddy, the 5 of us. We could have got to her in time. She would have slowed us down, mumbled Jacob. No point in all of us dying. The train's lights flickered as it passed under a bridge. Jacob folded his arms defiantly and glanced out of the window as the silence stretched between them. A spray of sparks lit up the darkness outside the train as the driver braked on his turn. She might still be alive, offered Ella, breaking the hostile silence. Did you see the size of that guy's knives? Henry shuddered. Oh, poor kid. I still don't see why we had to take the train. We had a very serviceable car. Jen broke off, looking at Henry sternly. Well, it was a car, at least. We could be miles away by now. Jacob shook his head. No good. He gets into your mind, makes you see things. We would have lasted about 10 minutes before we ended up wrapped around a tree. At least with the train, we have a chance to get away. Jacob looked up. These things are automatic, right? There's no driver? The others stared at him. In the ringing silence, they could very clearly hear the sound of a radio crackling through the metal door that separated them from the cab. A man's voice was humming along. Jacob moved first, exploding out of his seat and tugging frantically at the emergency cord. It came off in his hand. Slowly, he turned and looked at the others, who stared back at him, horrified. As one, they leapt to their feet and pounded on the door to the driver's cab. Stop the train! You have to stop the train! Jacob yelled. Open the door! We have to get off this train! Oh, fuck, we gotta get off this train! 4 silver knives burst through the door, puncturing the thick metal as though it were cardboard. Dr. Spencer gasped as one of the knives slashed open her suit, impelling her through her shoulder with a sharp, sluicing sound. The knife withdrew and she crumpled to the floor. Sally! Ella rushed to her aid. Sally Spencer stared stupidly at the bright wash of crimson seeping through her expensive suit and swore, weakly reaching out a hand to touch the blood. An instant later she was thrown forward as the door rocked with a savage blow. A welt appeared in the top of the door, then another, then another. The metal started to split with an alarming creak, weakened by the sledgehammer-like blows from the other side. Get her out of here! Ella was frantic. She grabbed Sally under the arms, ignoring her cry of pain, and dragged her bodily away from the door. Run! Yelled Jacob. Behind them, the door rattled in its frame under a fresh onslaught of blows. Smoke started to hiss from beneath it. Jacob danced back and forth impatiently along the aisle. Leave her! He'll kill us all! Just go! He shouted. The others stared at him. I didn't hear that, snapped Ella. She glared at Jacob, giving him her most withering stare. Fury lent her voice strength. You! Help us move her right now! Jacob unwillingly jogged back down the aisle, his gaze fixed on the vibrating door. Henry and Jen took a hand apiece and pulled the stricken psychiatrist to her feet. Together they half carried, half dragged Sally down the carriage toward the door, bumping into seats and support poles. They reached the far door separating the compartments and stumbled through it, slamming it behind them. Jacob slumped down against the door, his eyes wide, staring at nothing. Ella grabbed his arm and tried to pull him onward. What are you doing? This is no time to give up. Are you kidding? This is the perfect time to give up, Jacob whimpered. There's nowhere to go. We're trapped on this train. We're all going to die. Okay, that's it, kid. Shut your mouth or I'll shut it for you. Henry! Well, he's getting on my nerves. Henry glared at Jacob. We're all going to die, indeed. What B-movie are you from exactly? Your parents must be real proud of you. My parents are dead, said Jacob. Freddy killed them and he's going to kill me too, and you with me. He stared furiously at Henry. That door won't hold him forever, dumb fuck. You want to be responsible for the death of everyone in here? Keep on yapping. He glanced around quickly, then leapt up. Come on. We got to shore up this door. If we can trap him, we might stand a chance. Without waiting for a reply, Jacob started ripping up seats in the carriage. his wiry muscles bulging as he pulled the thin plastic chairs away from their metal frames. Years in the institution had hardened him, and for the first time he put it to good use. With the strength born of terror, he tore a long metal pole free from under one of the seats, jamming it through the handle of the door separating the compartments. Then he stepped back and snapped a swift, powerful kick at it, bending it up into a U-shape and sealing the doors. After a moment of sulky silence, Henry joined in, pulling wooden panels off the wall and shoving them under the door, forming a crude door jamb. Ella helped Dr. Spencer to a seat. She collapsed into it, clutching at her shoulder, deathly pale. What does he want?" gasped Sally. "Why is he trying to kill us?" "Because that's what he does." Jacob leaned back, struggling with the stubborn panel. "He kills because he enjoys it." Sally shook her head, struggling to sit up. "I don't buy that. Everyone's got a motive, a reason why they do things." "Yep, and Freddy's feeling real motivated to kill us right now," said Henry. "But 10 out of 10 for the shrink job, seriously." "He's a human being," Sally persisted. "Or he was one. Everyone wants something, right? So what does Freddy want?" In the next carriage, the sound of frustrated banging grew louder. "All of us dead?" suggested Jen. The threat of imminent death seemed to have focused her. Compared to the rest of them, she seemed positively cheerful. "He was killed by a lynch mob, yes," said Sally. "So perhaps he wants to avenge his own death?" Yeah, keep up, Grandma. He wants to kill the kids of the guys who murdered him. Same old, snapped Jacob. But you guys weren't involved in all that shit. He wants to kill me because I'm stopping people from dreaming, and he can't get back into the real world. He wants to kill you because you're in his way. Simple as that. "You've really lost the plot, haven't you?" said Jen. Light flooded the carriage as the train whooshed through another station. It showed no sign of stopping. Jacob rubbed his arms anxiously, glancing out of the window. The banging next door seemed to have stopped, but he knew this was not a good sign. "Freddy was a serial killer, right?" Said Sally, doggedly holding her shoulder. "Right, whatever." Jacob paced back and forth, thinking. "Well, perhaps we can work with that." Sally winced, clutching at her punctured shoulder again. "I did a study on serial killers for my finals. A lot of them are brain damaged in some way, usually through some kind of head trauma sustained while growing up. Or sometimes they're just born with something neurologically wrong with their brains." Sally coughed, her face contorting in pain. "But one thing they all have in common is they lack empathy. They don't have the ability to sympathize with how other people are feeling." "I've met people like that. They're called men," said Jen. "I'm serious. You could beg, you could cry, you could scream for your life, and your average full-blooded serial killer wouldn't give a shit. He'd just see you as an object, a thing he could use for his own foul purposes before discarding. He'd be coldly logical." She winced as she held her shoulder. "About the whole thing, rationalizing it to a point where he thinks that he's doing the right thing by killing you." "Does she ever shut up?" snapped Jacob, staring at the door. Sally sat up with an effort, becoming even paler. "If we want to defeat Freddy, we need to think on his terms, without emotion, just using logic, unless someone happens to have a flamethrower handy." She snorted. "I think I'm a little hysterical. Could someone pass me a tissue, please?" Jacob reached out and grabbed Jen's pink sweater, which was tied around her waist. Before she could protest, he ripped a sleeve off of it and folded it up, pressing it over the wound in Sally's shoulder to staunch the bleeding. "Here, use this." "Hey, that was Prada." "Yeah, well now it's nada. You want Miss Freud here to kick the bucket before she's finished her psychobabble? I'm sure we're all dying to know exactly why Freddy's about to kill us." Jacob stood up, dusting off his hands. "Okay, door's sealed. We gotta go, kids." Together, they helped Dr. Spencer to her feet and stumbled down the aisle toward the next carriage. They were nearly at the second set of doors when a loud crash echoed, and the sound of tearing metal filled the air. Then everything fell silent. Jen peered over her shoulder, nervous. "Perhaps he gave up?" Don't say that. Never say that. They all piled through into the next carriage. It was deserted, as was the one after that and the one after that. Finally, they reached the other end of the train and could go no further. The girls sat down exhausted while Jacob and Henry went to secure the door behind them. Ella examined Sally's wound gingerly. It was bleeding profusely and her arms and shoulders were drenched with blood. She was deathly pale from shock. Ella manipulated the reading lamp on the ceiling above, trying to get more light on the wounds, when there was a gentle cough from behind them. Ella looked up to see a ticket inspector hovering nervously in the aisle by the end door, his gaze flicking from one to the next with an expression of horrified fascination. Ella glanced at the others in surprise, then winched her lips up into something resembling a normal expression. She could imagine how they must all look. Jen and Henry soaked through and caked in mud, herself and the other two spattered with blood, Sally looking like a car crash victim. The inspector obviously hadn't heard the commotion at the other end of the train, and looked faintly bemused as to why the train had sailed through the last 3 stations without stopping. Nevertheless, he did what he was trained to do and reached for his ticket machine. "Tickets, please," he said, unable to take his eyes off Ella and the other 4 crazy people bleeding all over his nice, clean carriage. "We don't have any," said Ella. "Look, there's been an accident. The driver's been hurt. Please tell me you know how to stop this train." The ticket inspector's expression turned to one of alarm. "I don't know," he said. "I'm new here. They've only just taught me how to use the coffee machine." "Do you have a radio, some way of contacting the station?" "No, nothing like that." Ella sagged, her hopeful expression turning into one of despair. "Well, we're screwed then." Wait a minute. What's this button do?" The inspector peered at a control panel mounted into the wall by the door. "What button?" Ella jumped to her feet and ran toward him, her eyes alive with hope. He beckoned her to him and put a hand on her shoulder, guiding her to the panel. Ella's brow knitted in confusion as she surveyed the bewildering tangle of wires and switches. There was a large green button in the middle of the red panel. Ella hesitated, then reached out a finger toward it. "Ella, get away from him!" Jen screamed. Ella jumped and turned to face the ticket inspector. He beamed down at her, the smile frozen on his face. His skin was beginning to melt. As Ella backed off in horror, the skin of his face suddenly detached and slid forward over his features like a cheap Halloween mask. His flesh liquefied, then reformed into a face from her worst nightmares. Then the ticket inspector was gone, and Freddy stood in his place in full uniform, grinning maniacally. He raised his blood-stained fingernails and spread them in front of him like a fan, then reached down to turn the handle of the fare-collecting machine, strung around his neck. "I'm gonna need to see your tickets!" On the other side of town, Officer Goodman ran down the brightly lit corridor of the deserted police station to answer the single ringing phone. He was supposed to be off duty now, but what with all the paperwork the day had generated, he decided to stay late, to catch up on some of his filing and get a head start on tomorrow. Grumbling under his breath, he seized the phone off its hook to shut it up. "Springwood PD." "Goodman, that you?" Sheriff Williams asked. Officer Goodman swallowed his gum and stood up straighter. "Yes, sir. I need a chopper and as many units as you can get to Parkway train station. Charge it to the account and get your ass out here right now. Stat. Have you found the boy?" There was a pause on the other end. "You could say that." In the rear carriage of the moving train, the 5 friends stood in the frozen little tableau, hypnotized by the grinning maniac in front of them. Freddy's warped, scarred face was alight with a feral joy. He looked eagerly from one to the next, clicking his fingernails impatiently on the ticket machine. He knew he had them, and he intended to make the most of it. "Oh, no tickets?" he rasped, his eyes glinting with pleasure. "You know there's a penalty fare!" His eyes looked sidelong at Ella and licked his lips slowly, grotesquely. Jacob was the first to react. "Run!" he yelled, shattering the spell. Without waiting for a reply, he whirled and sprinted down the aisle toward the end of the door, the one that he had just spent 5 minutes barricading. A long metal pole was jammed through the lock, sealing it shut. Jacob stared down at the damaged lock, as though the very heat of his gaze could melt it open, then grabbed the handle and rattled it frantically, futilely. He had to get out of there. He couldn't let Freddy win, not after all of this time. There was a strangled yelp from behind him. Jacob whipped around to see that Freddy had Dr. Spencer by the throat and had hoisted her up off the ground, as though she weighed no more than a child. The others were huddled together on the opposite side of the seats, a look of abject terror on their faces. "Let go of her, you freak!" Ella ran up to Freddy and beat at him uselessly with her fists. Freddy sneered down at her, then gave a contemptuous flick of his wrist, shoving Ella away from him. Ella flew the length of the carriage and crashed into a window. Glass clattered to the ground, and Ella slid to the floor, dazed and bleeding. The cool night breeze entered the carriage, sending trash whirling into the air. "You're all my children now," laughed Freddy. Dr. Spencer kicked and struggled uselessly, coughing and choking as his grip tightened around her throat. Freddy's eyes blazed with mirth as he pulled back his arm, preparing to strike. Without even thinking, Jacob wrenched the metal pole out of the lock and sprinted back down the carriage. "Get away from her!" he yelled. Then he brought the pole down in a sweeping arc that should have taken Freddy's head off. But before the metal even made contact, there was a flash of light, and the top half of the pole melted clean away. Pain shot through his hand, and Jacob dropped the red-hot pole. It hit the ground with a clatter and vanished in an implosion of blue smoke. He backed up, furious and frustrated. "Let her go!" he cried. Freddy only snickered, then spitefully lashed out with his knife glove, slicing Sally's arm open as she raised it feebly in defense. "That all you got? Ooh, you're so scary," he taunted, grinning wildly. "Come on, hero. I'm serious. Try again. Give me one reason I should let this bitch go." Jacob cast around frantically for a weapon, his mind racing. What was it Sally had said about defeating Kruger? God, he wished he could remember. Even as the thought hit him, he saw that the doctor's lips were moving as she whispered something to Freddy, fighting to get the words out from her crushed windpipe. Jacob stepped back, his muscles bunched and ready to fight. But to his surprise, Kruger was no longer paying him any attention, concentrating instead on Sally. As he watched, Freddy's expression turned from anger to one of suspicion. He frowned, then cocked his head to one side like a dog, listening intently. Then a look of puzzled wonder spread over his face. "So," he said slowly, "you think that I only kill because I had a traumatic upbringing and my peers rejected me. So I took to getting back at society in the only way I knew how. The son of 100 maniacs getting revenge for being picked on." Sally nodded with difficulty, then whispered something else, struggling for air. Freddy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And I should let you go, because it's not really you I'm trying to kill. But it's really aspects of myself that I hate. That's what I'm really trying to murder." Sally nodded in affirmative, then whispered again into Freddy's decayed ear, her breath hissing through her bruised throat. Freddy's eyebrows flew up in suspicion. "So it's pointless for me to keep on killing, because everyone I wanted to punish is dead, and I've avenged my own death, and I can rest now? Huh? Is that it?" Sally nodded weakly. All around her the others watched with bated breath as Freddy carefully lowered Dr. Spencer to the ground, mulling over her words. He reached up to scratch his head with the tip of his fingernails, drawing blood. He didn't appear to notice. "Interesting theory," he said. Then his hand lashed out and he lifted Sally off the ground again. Her legs flailed in the air and she started to choke. "But totally wrong! You see, Doctor, I kill because I enjoy it. That's all." Dr. Spencer thrashed around madly, blood streaming down her shoulder, fighting to free herself from Freddy's iron grip. Freddy smiled cruelly. "Why don't you analyze this, bitch?" With that, he casually lopped Sally's head off. For a second, nobody moved. The decapitated head bounced once on the floor, then rolled down the carriage to where the others stood, frozen in shock. "Now that's a real head job!" Freddy dropped the decapitated body. "Anyone else got a theory for Mr. Kruger?" The carriage erupted into a riot of confusion. The others turned and bolted for the door, pushing and shoving each other out of the way in their frantic bid for freedom. Freddy grinned wildly. "Thought not," he said. Then he was after them, stalking down the aisle, laughing with the fun of it all. They fled down the carriageway ahead of him, shrieking his panic as they passed the prone form of Ella. Henry grabbed her and bodily hauled her upright, shaking her roughly. "Come on, girlie, on your feet, we gotta go." Ella's eyes focused on the rapidly approaching Freddy, and suddenly launched herself out of their arms towards the door, which was shaking under an onslaught of frantic kicks from Jacob. She reached him just as the door gave way, debris flying out from underneath. Jacob yanked it wide open and ran through, followed quickly by the others. Together they ran down the train, boots clanging on the steel flooring. Freddy followed them, cackling loudly. He punched his glove hand upward, smashing the carriage light, then dragged his fingernails with a flourish along the metal walls, making a loud screech that never seemed to end. The carriage filled with the horrible sound, ear-splittingly loud, and Freddy laughed, enjoying the hunt. Ahead of him, the terrified teenagers clapped their hands over their ears and continued their flight, running mindlessly even though they knew there was nowhere to run to. Freddy's black heart leapt at the sight. Oh, the chase, the hunt, the kill! It was a pattern as old as nature herself, horde that she was, and every cell in him thrummed with anticipation. That was the way it should be, and Freddy was keen to enjoy every single twisted second of it. He waved a hand toward the fleeing kids, and the door in front of them banged shut. The blonde girl yanked it open again and fled through it with a cry of fear, the two boys hot on her heels. But the brunette was a second too slow. Another wave of Freddy's hand, and the metal support poles on either side of the door twisted themselves free, then wove themselves over the door like creeping ivy on speed, sealing it shut. The brunette tugged at it frantically, then turned to face him as he strode toward her, flattening her back against the door, her face a stark mask of terror. The lighting in the whole train flickered off, and on spasmodically burning a vision of the approaching Freddy into her retinas. There was nowhere left for her to run. Freddy smiled wickedly, then he raised his knives and stepped toward her. Next door, Ella paused mid-flight as a piercing scream rang through the carriage. "Jen!" she gasped. She stopped dead, and Jacob and Henry almost plowed into the back of her. "We can't help her now, just keep going," cried Jacob. "You really don't get it, do you?" Ella yelled. "You don't just give up on people." Shaking his head, Jacob tried to push past Ella, but she grabbed him and threw him back. Jacob rebounded off the wall and spun around angrily. "What's your deal?" "My deal is that my friend is about to be killed," snapped Ella, "and I'm going back to save her. You want to run away like a big crybaby? Be my guest. Henry!" "What?" "Go try and stop the train. I'm going back." "No way, dude." Ella swung around and seized him by the lapels. "Henry, if you don't stop the train, we're all going to die. You know about all that technical stuff, levers and gadgets and whatnot. How about you quit flapping your yap and go save a life?" Henry looked at her unhappily, mouth open to protest, then he saw the look in Ella's eyes. He stepped forward swiftly and planted a quick kiss on her lips, then turned and ran off down the carriage. Ella turned to Jacob, blustering to cover her embarrassment. "I sure am getting lucky today." Jacob just looked at her and raised an eyebrow, blood running down his face as another disembodied scream tore through the air. He watched her go, several conflicting expressions fighting each other on his face. Then he banged his fist on the seat rack and set off after her. In the next car, Jen cowered by the door as Freddy sauntered toward her, grinning from ear to ear. "You know what I love most about women," said Kruger, flashing his blades. "Killing them!" He tipped his rotted head onto one side, regarding her thoughtfully. "You're a little old for me, but you'll do." "I'll give you anything you want," sobbed Jen. Freddy looked her up and down, then shook his head. "The only thing I want from you is already gone. My little cherry pie," he said, leering at her. Jen blushed. "Too bad you were too busy out screwing boys behind your boyfriend's back to save yourself for him. Is that why he hated you?" "My boyfriend's dead," Jen almost shouted. "Good thing, too, 'cause he'd beat the shit out of you if he knew what a little slut you are." He smiled. "That Matthew boy, now he was entertaining." "What? How do you know about Matt?" Jen sniffed, backing away. Freddy just smiled. "He told me all about you, the things you guys did." Jen bristled. "I don't believe you. We didn't. Well, we did, but he listened to me. He gave a shit. He made me feel like I mattered." "Yeah, right. Whatever," Freddy snickered. "You think he liked you for your personality? Then you're stupider than you look. And you look like a fucking retard." Freddy smiled, his eyes bright with malice. "He just wanted to screw you. That's what all boys want." "You're wrong." "Oh, spare me the sentimental shit. I've heard it all before." Freddy reached out to grab Jen, but she ducked under his reach and danced back along the train, away from him. "Anyhow," said Freddy, "the little shit's dead now, so who the fuck cares?" "He's not dead. He's just Jen stared at Freddy, horrified. "You didn't..." Freddy doffed his hat and bowed low, as though collecting an Oscar. When his head came up again, he was smirking. "You bastard!" Jen ran at Freddy, attacking him, in a flail of arms, legs, and flashing red fingernails. Freddy tolerated her attack for a moment, laughing, then grabbed her by the arm and viciously slung her across the room, the way one might toss a bag of trash into a dumpster. Jen plowed into a row of seats, smashing them to kindling. She raised herself on an elbow, groaning, then dizzily tried to get to her feet. Freddy smirked to himself and started toward her, then spun around as a crash came from behind him. Crump! The head of an axe came smashing through the door. The metal ivy twined around it, screamed in pain and withdrew, solidifying back into ordinary poles, and the door abruptly burst open. Jacob stepped through, closely followed by Ella. "Get away from her, you son of a bitch!" Jacob cried. Freddy scowled at him. "Don't you dare talk about my mother like that!" he snapped. "That's my job! In the meantime, hey!" His foul body rocked with the sudden impact, and he looked down in shock to see a wooden spike projecting from his chest. He sagged slightly, black blood oozing from the wound. "Who dares?" His head snaked around like a cobra, and he eyeballed Jen, who was standing behind him clutching the broken end of a chair support. She gave it a hard twist, her eyes bright with violence, and Freddy yelled in pain before spinning around and dealing her a pile-driver blow that knocked her clean to the other side of the carriage. She hit the wall hard, dashing her head on a metal jacket rack with a crack that echoed all the way down. She fell to the ground unmoving. Freddy's charred hand closed around the bloody strut projecting from his chest. He sucked in a breath, then yanked it out with a grunt and tossed it onto the floor. His gaze snapped upwards and locked with Jacob's. "Right, you little..." Suddenly his eyes flew open. Then he screamed, his face blurring and twisting in the flashing light. Beneath his skin, a second set of features became suddenly and shockingly visible, like a moving hologram. The mouth on the second face opened and closed soundlessly, as though trying to speak. Jacob instantly recognized it. "Cain!" Jacob turned and ripped a red fire extinguisher off the wall, then swung it at Freddy, while he was distracted, catching him a glancing blow on the side of the head. Freddy snarled and struck out at him, but his eyes were unfocused and the blow went wide. Ella, it's Kane. He's trying to break free. We have to help him. Ella understood quickly and grabbed hold of Freddy's arm as he wrestled with himself, holding him in place, while Jacob hit him again and again with the fire extinguisher. With a roar of rage, Freddy threw her off him, then doubled over, howling in pain. His form flickered like a cheap fairground illusion, Kane's body clearly visible inside of his own. Suddenly there was a flash of light, and Freddy, Kane, fell to his knees. Jacob looked down and saw that he'd become Kane again. A white specter stood over him, Freddy's ethereal body glowering at him, before it suddenly span off into the air in an oily black whirlwind. It vanished into the ceiling with a crack of muted thunder, leaving behind nothing but a scorch mark on the cheap tin roofing. Kane was left behind on the floor, groaning and bleeding. Jacob rushed to his side. Kane, are you alive, man? Not sure. Kane slumped to the floor, looking around him blearily. His graying hair was sticking up in all directions with static, and his normally colorful shirt was stained with blood. What happened? You were possessed by Freddy. Something went wrong. Jacob looked up, his eyes widening with the sudden realization. We have to stop this train. We're on a train. Yes, Freddy killed the driver. Ella's friend went to try to stop it. We have to help him before Kruger gets back. A sudden jolt rocked the carriage. Jacob was thrown to one side as the floor was blasted into the air in an appallingly loud explosion of dark energy. Electricity crackled and all the lights flickered, then went out. A moment later, Freddy burst through the floor, then swirled to a halt up near the ceiling. He glared down at them, his body lit by an unidentified red light. What did you do to me? He yelled. His voice was crackly and distorted, as though the sound was coming through a cheap intercontinental phone line. That's none of your concern now, Kane said calmly, although he looked like death. His personal sense of calm seemed to have returned. With effort, he got to his feet and smoothed down his pants, looking down at the blood on his hands as though it offended him. Then he rummaged around in his back pocket for the Death Stone. He held it up, aiming it at Freddy like it was some kind of weapon. He uttered a quiet word, and a crack of plasma lightning hit the carriage, filling the air with the sharp tang of ozone. They all recoiled as the plasma shot through Freddy's disembodied form and was sucked into the Dreamstone, which began glowing a deep purplish red. The glow flooded up Kane's arm, suffusing his flesh until his entire body was glowing faintly, small beads of electricity crawling across his skin like worms on a corpse. The others continued backing away, unnerved. As Jacob watched, the light in the Death Stone went out, and Kane's blue eyes flooded with the trickle of silver fire. His skin writhed as his wounds spontaneously regenerated, closing by themselves with tiny flashes of flame. The air hummed as Kane turned his silver gaze on Freddy, his black hair crackling with electricity. Now that was a dirty trick, Kruger. Killing that little girl. You nearly had me there. But things are back on track now. As he spoke, the light in the Death Stone went out. Kane dropped it back into his top pocket, then stretched out a hand and waved it experimentally, as though shooing away a troublesome swarm of mosquitoes. Across the room, Freddy flinched, then rocketed up to the ceiling with a howl of rage. He landed with a smack on the roof, sprawling flat on his back. How dare you! He roared. Rolling over, he flipped to his feet like an acrobat and stood up on the ceiling, defying gravity as if he was in some cheap 80s music video. He removed his hat, flexed the din out of it with an audible pop, then set it back on his head. Clicking his finger knives menacingly, he stalked over to Kane and stopped barely 3 feet away, still upside down, regarding him through narrowed eyes. So that's the way it is, he growled. Kane inclined his head. Apparently so. So let's do this! Abruptly, Freddy struck out with his gloved hand, aiming to decapitate Kane. His finger knives passed right through him. Kane laughed. Dream powers only, it seems. Lucky for me. Freddy's jaw clenched. Then his eyes blazed bright yellow. There was a whoop of inward rushing air, and Kane's hair exploded into flame. He yelled in pain and ran around in circles, frantically beating at his head. Freddy barked with laughter. "Now that's what I call entertainment." Then he went flying as Kane unleashed a similar volley of firepower at him, blue flames pouring from his outstretched hands. His eyes screwed up in concentration. Freddy swung round to retaliate, but Kane was no longer there. He blinked out of existence, then reappeared upside down on the ceiling, next to Freddy. He spread his arms wide like a gunslinger and beckoned to Freddy, his eyes glinting in anticipation. The battle had begun. At the other end of the train, in the driver's cab, Henry stood looking down at the control panel in anguish. There was no steering wheel, no foot pedals, just a big flashing sea of crazy-colored lights, like an airplane cockpit. There were no labels, no clue as to what any of the controls did. He'd known that he'd been foolish to hope for a big obvious button marked stop, but he was still disappointed not to find one. A brightly lit station loomed in the front window, then flew by. Henry cracked his knuckles in front of him, then reached out, fingers shaking, and pulled a lever at random. Nothing happened. Oddly encouraged by this, he pressed a half-dozen other buttons that looked promising, then reached out and took hold of the big lever in the middle of the board. He pulled on it, but it seemed to be stuck. He pulled harder, and myriad flashing red lights suddenly came on over his head. A low beeping sound filled the cab. "Not good, not good," Henry muttered to himself, flicking a series of switches beside the lever. A flashing light came on, and a little sign lit up above him reading, "Purge toilets, yes or no." Henry cussed to himself. Up on the ceiling of the wrecked carriage, Kane stepped back a pace or two, eyeing Freddy. His entire being thrummed with power, and he had never felt more alive. The Death Stone in his pocket was heating up, spewing out its stolen power into him, filling him with a wash of crackling energy. He felt incredible, invincible, as though he could do anything. All he had to do was to get the sacrifice over and done with, anoint the Death Stone with blood, and Freddy's powers would be his forever. But first, he needed the new sacrifice. Kane glanced down at the three teenagers huddled at the back of the carriage and smiled to himself. Jacob had already fulfilled his purpose, as far as he was concerned, but he might be able to find some other use for him in the future. The two girls, on the other hand, would do nicely. Maybe if he sacrificed them both, he'd get double the power? It was going to be fun finding out. But first, he had to get Freddy out of his face. The freak was semi-transparent, and Kane knew this meant his power was on the fritz. All the more for him. Kane grinned and gave a jerk of his head. A ring of ghostly flames sprang up around Freddy, trapping him. Freddy shielded his face from the roaring heat, then blinked hard, directing a spray of invisible water at them. The flames went out. Kane chewed on his bottom lip, contemplating. Then his eyes lit up. He raised his hand in front of him, and a jet of molten tar shot out, smacked into Freddy, and knocked him down. Freddy howled in pain as the hot tar rapidly solidified, trapping him. He nodded quickly, and a wave of crackling hoarfrost spread out from him, turning the tar to black ice. His fingernails started glowing. Within seconds, they had turned red-hot and melted through the ice. Freddy ripped his arm free with a roar and raised it high into the air. His fingernails liquefied and reformed into a giant hammer, which he brought down onto the ice. It shattered into a million fragments, freeing him. Freddy stood up, cackling triumphantly. "Is that all you've got?" Kane quickly raised a hand, but he wasn't quick enough. Freddy gave a flick of his leather-clad wrist, and there was a tearing sound as dozens of anti-drug posters pulled themselves off the walls of the carriage. They spun through the air, folding themselves into a flock of origami paper birds, which flew at Kane, attacking him with bleeding wings and snapping paper teeth. He yelled in pain as his exposed skin was torn up in hundreds of tiny paper cuts. Then his eyes widened as he saw what Freddy was holding. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me!" he exclaimed, then ducked as a giant 6-foot-high lemon flew overhead, splattering into the end wall and exploding in a shower of juice. Kane yelped in pain as its Acidity splattered over him, washing into his cuts. Freddy smiled evilly. "Ooh, that's gotta sting," he said. Kane quickly waved a mini thundercloud into existence and washed the burning liquid off of him, then turned to Freddy enraged. "You're gonna pay for that, Kruger," he said. A howling wind sprang up, knocking Freddy off his feet. Kane stalked toward him, eyeing Freddy's finger knives. As he walked, a rush of silver flooded up his arm, crystallizing into the shape of 5 knives, just like Freddy's. "Ready to die, Freddy?" he said. Freddy just shook his head in amusement. He raised his own arm, smirking, his eyes dark with malice. "Kercheck!" His razor-sharp finger knives extended one at a time, shooting outwards until they were all 3 feet long. The points extended, turning a glassy black color, until they were so thin and sharp that they were practically invisible. The air hummed, and Kane felt his power being sucked out of him, as Freddy drew energy from the very air, becoming solid once again. Freddy swung his hand backward, moving faster than the eye could follow, and a thunderclap sounded as the tips of his knives sliced the very air open. Kane gulped. Freddy raised an eyebrow, then spun around and sliced an 8-foot section out of the roof of the carriage. Stars and rushing treetops were revealed through the gaping hole. Under Kruger's evil gaze, the section of roof shattered into 1,000 fragments, hung in the air for a moment, then zipped toward Kane like 1,000 deadly needles, aiming to rip him to shreds. With a cry, Kane threw up his hands and flung a powerful wave of magnetism at Freddy. The roof fragments paused inches from him, reversed their direction like compass needles, and went flying back toward an unprepared Freddy, skewering him like a pincushion. Freddy shrieked in pain and surprise, then yelped as the metal of his extended finger knives was caught by the magnetism, dragging him down to his knees as they thunked the metal of the carriage roof. For a brief moment, he was trapped. Kane advanced on him, grinning humorlessly. His own finger knives flickered and morphed in quick succession into a sword, then a bandsaw, then a chainsaw. They started to buzz, sparks flying out of the razor-sharp chain. Stepping back, he wielded the saw and swung it sharply down toward Freddy's exposed head. Down on the floor, Jacob turned to Ella. I think this would be a good time to leave." Ella was bending over Jen's comatose form, checking her pulse. "You think?" she said, wiping blood off her hands. "Jen's out cold. You think we can get her past those guys without them noticing?" Jacob glanced up as the 2 titans were battling on the ceiling. "Sure," he said. "You remember to pack that Uzi?" Up on the ceiling, Kruger's eyes widened as he saw Kane's chainsaw whirring down towards his face at a high speed. He quickly ripped his hand free of his glove, then lunged to one side as the chainsaw buried itself in the roof. As Kane fought to free himself, Freddy stood up on the ceiling, dusting himself off. With the snap of his fingers, a new glove formed on his hand. The old one bursting into blue flame and vanishing in a puff of sulfuric smoke. Kane tugged himself free, and the 2 killers stood and stared at one another. Kane's expression was blank, determined, while Kruger's yellow eyes shone with anticipation. They both moved at once. Kruger struck out with his finger knives at superhuman speed, aiming to sever Kane's head. But Kane dodged aside at the very last second, his reaction still sluggish from his injuries. More by accident than intent, he brought his whirring chainsaw hand up to lock with Freddy's knives in a blaze of blue sparks. Metal screamed, then crunched, and Freddy howled in pain as one of his finger knives was wrenched off by the whirling chain and flung across the room, burying itself in the door control hatch. With a polite ring of the bell, the carriage door hissed open. Howling wind flooded the car, whipping debris up into the air and sending Kane tumbling off the ceiling. His chainsaw buried itself deeply in the floor, halting the blade. One moment later, the internal mechanism blew up with a bang. Quick as a snake, Freddy blinked out of existence and reappeared next to Kane. With a casual swing of his 3 remaining lethal blades, he deftly lopped Kane's arm off. Bone crunched, and the severed limb fell to the floor, spurting blood. "Gotcha!" Freddy said with a grin. Kane screamed. Chapter 17. Jen! Jen, wake up! Jen stirred, groaning, eyes tight shut. She rolled over, irritably shielding her face from the light, trying to find a more comfortable position. Her head was pounding with the relentless, throbbing pain, and she felt like someone had just beaten the hell out of her legs with a rubber mallet. This was one bitch of a hangover, and on a school night at that. She never learned. And she'd had the worst dream. First, she'd ruined her brand-new Prada sweatshirt in a muddy puddle. Then some guy with knives for fingers had been chasing her. And then she was trapped with him on the driverless train with two cute but mentally unstable boys and a girl from her class with questionable fashion sense. What a nightmare. Someone shook her by the shoulders, more urgently this time. Jen frowned beneath closed eyelids. "Leave me alone," she said. "I don't want to go to school, okay?" "She's delirious," said a voice. That was a nasty bump on the head. "We have to move her. If Freddy wins, we're toast." Freddy? Oh no! A sickening feeling filled her. Jen opened one eye, then the other. She looked around her, then she closed them, groaning again and curling into a fetal ball. At the other end of the carriage, Kane lay on the floor in a pool of his own blood, clutching at the stump of his arm, while warm blood flooded through his fingers. Hot pain stabbed through him, but he fought to stay conscious, knowing that if he let himself black out, he would quite likely bleed to death right there on the floor. A booted foot filled the field of vision, and he quickly looked up, his face the color of ash. Freddy towered over him, a sneer on his thin lips as he stood amid the ruins of the trashed train carriage. Flying debris swirled around him as the wind scoured the car. With the playful whoop, Freddy lashed out with his gloved hand, slicing a thick metal support pole in two in a spray of sparks. The pole started to topple, and Freddy expertly caught it in midair, flipped it around, and spun it in an interweaving pattern. He looked down at Kane as though he were a cockroach he was preparing to crush. "Any last words, Doctor?" "Two," Kane wheezed. "Fuck you." "Well said." Freddy grinned through rotten teeth and raised the broken pole, preparing to skewer him. Kane quickly let go of his stump and waved his other hand weakly, muttering under his breath like a bad magician. Freddy froze, his pole raised, eyes flickering left and right. Nothing seemed to have happened. He relaxed and tried to take a step forward, then hesitated in mid-stride. His gaze moved downward, and he stared at himself in disbelief. His legs were coated in thick plastic. His pants solidified and covered in paint. His joints seemed to have fused together. His head spun sideways, and he stared at himself in the crazed reflection of the shattered window. His jaw dropped. He had turned into a giant action figure. Freddy took a step forward, his joints sticking unpredictably, and stopped, unable to bend his own knees. He reached up to remove his hat so he could scratch his head. It was stuck down with superglue. In a fury, he lashed out at Kane, but his floppy plastic fingernails bent backward on contact, raising red welts on Kane's cheek, rather than slicing his face off. Denied the kill, Freddy threw back his head and howled in frustration. Kane rolled over desperately, fighting the pain of his severed arm, and struggled to get to his feet. His legs shook and slid out from under him as the shock hit, but he kept trying. He could not let Kruger kill him. Not now. Not when he was so close to achieving everything he'd worked for. He had some of Freddy's dream powers, but he was still human. That meant he could be hurt. That meant he could be killed. But Freddy was already dead. He didn't have that problem. A wave of nausea buzzed through Kane at the thought. He shook his head, fighting to clear it, then clutched hold of the nearest seat and pulled himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the broken support pole. He reached into his pocket for the Death Stone, the world blurring and spinning in front of his eyes. He had to complete his ritual before he lost too much more blood, or it would be all for nothing. In front of him, Freddy was busy morphing back to his original shape, the plastic evaporating off of him in clouds of foul-smelling steam. Within seconds, he would be lethal again. "Jacob!" Kane cried desperately. At the other end of the carriage, Jacob looked up. "Help me!" Kane cried. Jacob's gaze flicked to Freddy, who was nearly free. He jumped to his feet and raced over to his fallen mentor, winding his way around the scattered debris and torn seats. As Freddy advanced on them both, Jacob stood over Kane protectively, his wildly tangled hair streaming out behind him in the wind. He screwed up his eyes in concentration, fixing his gaze firmly on Freddy. The lights flickered, and a small cloud of white energy appeared over Jacob's head. Then it sputtered and went away. Jacob tried again with similar results. "I can't!" he yelled over the rising wind. "He doesn't dream!" "Everybody dreams!" snapped Kane. "Keep trying, boy!" "Time's up, scum!" shouted Freddy. He tried to move toward Kane, then stopped and looked down. His feet were stuck to the floor with melted plastic. He muttered a curse and yanked on his leg, trying to pull it free. While Freddy was occupied, Kane quickly pressed the death stone into Jacob's hand, along with a frayed piece of parchment, and pointed the shaking finger back along the carriage at Ella. "Change of plan," he gasped. "You have to finish the ritual." "What?" Jacob stared at Kane. "It's our only chance. Kill the girl. Anoint the stone with her blood and read these words out loud. It's the only way." "I'm not killing Ella," said Jacob. Kane shook his head irritably, then grunted with pain. "You can kill either girl. It doesn't matter. Quickly, or he'll kill us all." "But—" "Take my gun. She won't feel a fucking thing." "Kane, I'm not leaving you here." "Go, now," Kane bellowed. Jacob quickly pocketed the pistol Kane had slipped him, and danced backward out of reach. Moments later, Freddy freed himself and turned to Kane, leering. "Jacob, get away from him!" cried Ella. Jacob was only too happy to oblige. As Freddy closed in on Kane, he tore Ella and bent down, helping her lift the concussed Jen up into a sitting position. There was a large, rapidly swelling lump on her forehead. "We gotta go. Get up!" Jen reeled, clutching at Jacob's arm. "Can I go home now?" she asked. "You'll have to wait, honey," said Ella. "We've got a train to stop." Jacob looked down at Ella, his expression unreadable. "You go. Help that friend of yours." "And leave you two here? Are you kidding?" "I'll look after her," said Jacob, staring down at Jen. A howl came from the other end of the carriage. Jacob looked up to see Freddy bent over the broken body of Kane, wiping his blades on his sweater. Blood poured down Kane's shirt, but he was still moving weakly, trying to fend Freddy off. Freddy had cut Kane's throat. "Kane!" Jacob ran forward, but a wall of flames sprang up, blocking his path. He stared through the flames, powerless to do anything but watch, as Freddy closed in on his caseworker. Behind the flames, Kane made one feeble gesture, and a swarm of ghostly killer bees materialized in the air. They swooped down on Freddy, buzzing madly. Freddy waved his knife glove impatiently, and they turned to glass, clattering to the floor as they buzzed in furious circles, like bee-shaped spinning tops. Another wave of Kane's hand produced a spinning firebolt, but Freddy easily dodged it. It struck the seats behind him, turning the chairs to sugar and the upholstery to a singed tartan pattern. There was a sticky burp and the seats exploded, showering the carriage with goo. Giving up, Kane's form flickered as he tried to dematerialize, but he didn't have the strength. He slumped back to the carriage floor, exhausted. Freddy looked down at the stricken Kane and smiled, showing rotten yellow teeth. "You want to know the difference between you and me?" he growled. "I need to kill. You just want to kill. That's why. Freddy always wins." "Go to hell," whispered Kane, blood seeping through his lips. "Gladly," said Freddy. Then he held up a finger. "Oh, I've got a good one." He gave a flourish of his hand and vanished in a puff of orange smoke. A moment later, the flames in the carriage died away, thick black smoke rolling up from the charred seats. "Jacob!" gasped Kane. Jacob ran down the carriage, falling to his knees in front of Kane. The prone form seized hold of Jacob's shirt, the light rapidly fading from his eyes. "Kill the girl! You got—" he whispered, blood seeping from between his lips. "You got to. It's the only way to stop him. I know you can do it, Jacob." "Kane, listen to me," said Jacob, his voice thick with emotion. Then he stopped, glancing up in fear as a strange sound filled the room. It was Freddy's voice, singing a cheery song, and it seemed to be getting louder, as though he were falling from a great height. "Do me proud, kid," whispered Kane. Then he threw back his head and screamed as knives burst out of his wrists, his elbows, his knees. Jacob jumped to his feet and backed away in horror as Cain's body split open, tearing itself apart from neck to groin. Green and red fabric was visible inside the gory, glistening depths of his viscera. Then his body tore itself in two, and Freddy burst out from inside him, shedding his skin like a wetsuit. The demonic killer wiped the blood off his forehead, then reached down into the shuddering mess of gleaming organs and pulled out his hat, fanning himself with it. "Ooh, do not go in there," he said. He popped the hat back on his head, then studied the steaming corpse for a moment. "I kinda liked it. Shame he had to split." Freddy stepped over the butchered remains of Cain, the blood flowing off him in rivers. He pointed a finger at Jacob, his expression turning deadly serious. "I want a word with you," he growled. At either end of the carriage, the doors twisted themselves shut, the ceiling bowing down to meet the floor in a shriek of tortured metal. Jacob rose to his feet, dizzy with fear. There was nowhere left to run. Freddy bore down on the three teenagers huddled at the other end of the carriage, grinning like a skull. "Time to die, kiddies!" He stalked toward them down the ruined carriageway, windows and lights blowing out as he passed them. Boom, 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 plunging the carriage into semi-darkness. Wind and broken glass screamed into the carriage like an indoor hurricane, revealed like flash frames in the flickering lights. Freddy flung out his arms dramatically, and a second glove materialized on his other hand. He raked both set of claws down the side of the carriage as he closed in on the teens. Curtains of orange sparks pouring down and fizzing on the metal floor. Loud screeches on both sides. A twin scream of metallic death, their pitch intertwining in a complex, an ear-splitting harmonic of pain. Freddy laughed in delight at the sound. Jacob, Ella, and Jen shrank back, staring up at Freddy in terror. This was it. This was the end. As Freddy approached, Jacob's fingers stole inside his jacket and closed on the cold shape of the gun. It would be useless against Freddy, he knew. There was only one thing left to do. He numbly clicked off the safety catch, Cain's voice ringing in his head. "Kill the girl. It's the only way." He was out of time. He had to complete the ritual. But who would he kill? Jacob clenched his teeth in an agony of indecision, trying to force himself to be logical about this. His gaze flicked sideways at Ella, then Jen, while he measured them up in his head. 2 lives, 2 human beings, both healthy and strong, both young with their whole lives ahead of them. But Ella was much cuter than her friend. Jacob realized with a shock that he'd already made the decision to end a life. It would save 4 other lives, including his own. But now that the moment was upon him, he found himself repulsed by the pettiness of his reasoning. If only there was another way. As Freddy closed in on them, swiping aside an entire rack of broken seats with a vicious sweep of his arm, Jacob tensed. He had to decide, and if he made the wrong decision, they would all die. He had to kill, but he wasn't a killer. He wasn't like Freddy. Or was he? What made him different? A sudden thought struck Jacob with the icy clarity of logic. He froze, then let out his breath in a sigh that contained every ounce of pain, fear, and frustration from the last 5 years. He knew how to make things right, but he had to move quickly before he changed his mind. Pulling the death stone and the fragment of parchment out of his pocket with fumbling fingers, he quickly read the incantation aloud. He pressed the death stone against his right temple. Then he pulled out the gun and aimed it at the other side of his head. Jacob looked up into the hell-colored eyes of Freddy Krueger and made his decision. Back in the driver's cab, Henry had finally located the 2-way radio. It was an ancient model, but it worked. He was busy relating their sorry situation to the operator on the other end, his gaze fixed on the front window as the urban landscape sped by. Overhead, he heard the thump of rotors, barely audible over the howling of wind through the train, as a police helicopter tracked them, its searchlight fixed on the train. "And then this madman killed the driver, and now we're all going to die." "We diverted all other trains on the line," crackled the radio. "Way to go!" But the line terminates at the next station. You need to stop the train. That's what I've been trying to tell you. I don't know how. Henry thumped the control panel in frustration. There was a click and a hum, and the train's windshield wipers started up. Oh, that's very helpful, he shouted at the controls. He turned back to the radio. Can't you do anything from your end? We've been trying, sir. We're locked out. Something is jamming the frequency. You'll need to manually override the controls. How? See that big lever in front of you. Grab it and pull. When the train slowed down enough, apply the brake. Okay, I can do this, said Henry. He rubbed his hands together and reached out toward the lever, which suddenly blurred and became a deadly brown cobra. Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me. Henry stared at the creature in disbelief. It puffed up its hood and hissed at him menacingly. Without taking his eyes off the snake, Henry picked up the radio and pressed the send button. Houston, we have a problem, he said. Blam! The gun went off, deafeningly loud, making everything metallic in the car ring with the aftershock. Jacob pitched forward and hit the ground hard. For a moment he lay there, face down on the cold floor, stunned. Everything was quiet, save a high-pitched shriek in his left ear. He felt blood start to flow in a hot trickle, and after a moment of disorientation, he reached up a shaking finger to touch it. It was coming from his ear. Not, as he had dreaded, a large hole in his head. He was still alive. For now. Pain flooded through him, and Jacob winced as his ribs started to throb. Just a second before he had squeezed the trigger, something had hit him in the back, sledgehammer hard, knocking him to the ground and sending the bullet zipping wide over his head. Bemused, Jacob looked down. Jen was lying on the floor next to him, unmoving, clutching at her neck with limp fingers. Blood rushed out, forming a small but rapidly glowing puddle beside her. The way she lay there, it was quite apparent that she was dead. Ella stood beside her, shocked. Before he could even begin to process what had happened, Jacob felt cold hands seize hold of him. He was hoisted aloft by a very real, very pissed Kruger. You think you can escape me that easily, you little shit? Roared Kruger. Wham! He dealt Jacob a stinging blow to the side of his head. That's for the last month, he said. Jacob struggled against Kruger's death grip as blood started to flow from his nose. It was like being held in a truck crusher. And this is for eternity! Freddy drew back his hand again, aiming his knives at the throat, ready to strike. As he did so, Jacob saw a very familiar, faraway look in his eyes. Realization hit him in a flash. Freddy did dream. And this was what he dreamed about, the kill. And that meant that he had a chance. Scarcely daring to hope, Jacob locked eyes with his killer and concentrated. As Freddy reared back, his fingerknives flicking out toward his throat, there was a rushing sound and a roar of light. And then, quite suddenly, Jacob was inside Freddy's head. It was hot as hell in there. Flames flickered. People screamed, animals shrieked. Heat shimmered in the air, giving everything a hallucinatory look. There was a strong smell of burning flesh and the sound of running footsteps. It was a personal version of hell, in microcosm. And then there was the fear, much fear. Jacob couldn't see it, but damn, he could feel it. It was everywhere, all-pervading, all-consuming, and it clung to him like dead weights on a drowning man. He struggled to shake it off, but the harder he tried, the more powerful the feeling became, until it was almost overwhelming. His chest filled with panic, and his lungs felt like they were about to burst. You couldn't run from fear. Jacob struck out blindly at the empty air, reeling as he felt the fear ripping his mind open, and pouring a tidal flood of strange, brutal memories into his head. They assaulted him in a frantic blur of colors, pictures, and sounds. Freddy, aged 11, curled up under the bed, sobbing his heart out, as his drunken stepfather stalked around the house with a baseball bat, smashing furniture, shelves, light fittings, screaming things at his stepmother that no 11-year-old should hear. Freddy, aged 12, running blindly down a darkened alleyway, the black shape of his stepdad stalking along behind him, a broken whiskey bottle dangling from one hand. You're not sorry, you little shit. So help me God, I'll make you fucking sorry. Freddy, age 13, pulling the feathers off the still-living bird that one of the cats had brought in, before tossing it into the garbage disposal and hitting the crusher button, shrieking in fear and delight as blood fountained up across the ceiling. Freddy, age 14, stoically taking yet another beating from his dad's metal-tipped belt. "Thank you, sir. Can I have another?" Freddy, age 15, carving deep and intricate patterns into the flesh of his own chest with a straight razor, staring at himself in the mirror as he worked. "You want to know the secret of pain? If you just stop feeling it, you can start using it!" Freddy, age 16, lying on his back on blood-stained sheets and laughing insanely as a girl ran naked and screaming from the bedroom. Freddy, age 17, buying himself a new sweater with his first wage check from his school janitor job, at his stepfather's twisted, butchered remains burned away to nothing, deep in the heart of the school's boiler room. Freddy, age 25, stalking his first victim, such a pretty little girl, through the maze of the power plant's innards. The screams, the fear, the power. Finally, he was in control. There was a zipping, hissing sound, like steam flying backward into a kettle, and Jacob found that he too was suddenly running, his legs blurring beneath him, his white cotton dress flying around him as he ran. Behind him came the heavy footfalls of the nasty man with the glove, the bad glove, the one with all the sharp, pointy knives stuck in it. He rounded the corner, his blonde pigtails flying as he sobbed hysterically for his mother, and ran smack bang into the bad man. He shrieked in crazed terror. The man's hand snapped out and grabbed Jacob by the throat, then lifted him off the ground, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. His grip was wet and slimy, and his skin was writhing with worms. "Jacob!" he cried, his voice coming from everywhere at once. "I know you're in there!" Jacob screamed, and a moment later the bad man's body flew apart in a squirming shower of maggots. Jacob fell to the ground, curling into a fetal ball and wrapping his hands around his head, while the fear surged up into his throat like bile, choking him, paralyzing him. But he couldn't let the fear win. He was better than that, stronger than that. Jacob took a deep breath, fighting down the terror that lurked within him like poison, crushing the fear with his iron self-control. And when he looked up, the boiler room had vanished. He took a few calming breaths, then uncurled and shakily rose to his feet, looking around apprehensively. He was in a vast underground cavern. Steam hissed, and there was a smell of death in the air. Jacob started around him and gave a gasp of shock. The cavern stretched to infinity. Thousands of transparent doors lined the walls, each one revealing a view of people dying in 1,000 unspeakably agonizing ways. Mutilated bodies were nailed to the walls, naked and struggling, while molten tar dripped, saws buzzed, people screamed. "Welcome to my world, kid!" Jacob jumped and spun around. Freddy was standing behind him. He spread his arms in a gesture of generosity, his manic expression for once subdued, almost serene. "Like what I've done with the place?" Jacob backed away. "Not much." "Too bad, Pipsqueak. You're here for the long haul." Freddy cocked his head to one side, regarding Jacob with interest. "Wanna play a game? It's called Pick Your Fate." "My what?" "Your fate, jackass. Pick one." Freddy gestured up at the packed walls, at the seething mass of tormented humanity, writhing in their own individual hells. He grinned. "That's just for starters. We have the rest of eternity to get to know each other. Father to son." "You're not my father," Jacob shouted. Freddy tisked impatiently, then gave a wave of his hand. Beside him, one of the doors flew open, revealing the figure of a young woman, impaled on a spike, hanging on a wall. Jacob felt an icy wave of dread pour through him. No, it couldn't be. He peered closer. It was his mother. She was still alive, an ivory spike of bone punching through her back and emerging through the bloody mess of her chest. Her skin was malted and drenched in blood, and a tide of black ants crawling ceaselessly over her in a living carpet, chewing busily away at her flesh. Her eyes were wide open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Freddy clasped a hand on Jacob's shoulder as he stared, speechless with shock. "I told her when I killed her that I'd take good care of her little boy." Freddy gave a short, ugly laugh. "I'll do the same for you when you're dead. Nothing's too good for my special little friend." "You bastard!" Jacob swung around, fist at the ready. But Freddy was no longer there. He vanished with a snort of laughter and a crackle of light. Jacob looked around wildly and saw Freddy blink back into being beside one of the doors. The lights in the cavern died and the bank of spotlights hit the door. Jacob saw that his own name was emblazoned across the door in burning letters. He shrank away from it, appalled. "Choose a fate, kid!" Freddy cried, his voice echoing through the cavern. All around him the heads of the victims swiveled to watch, staring at Jacob with bloody eyes. A giant spectral clock appeared over his head, and the minutes started ticking down. "You got 10 seconds, kid!" "Screw you!" 8! Freddy started humming a dirge. "Give it up! You're already dead! Or you will be in 7 seconds!" Jacob stared at the broken, bloody mess of his mother and closed his eyes. There was only one thing left to do, though he really did not want to. But he had nothing to lose. Either way, he would be dead. Concentrating intently, he rallied the last of his powers. Then he released his hold over the townsfolk's dreams. Blam! 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 The doors all around the cavern blew open, and scorching white light poured out as the town's 15,000 residents began dreaming again. Screams filled the air, far off and metallic sounding. Freddy was distracted for 2 seconds. In that time, Jacob summoned the very last scrap of his borrowed dream powers and poured 18 years of hatred and fury into Freddy's mind. Then he visualized a fate for him. Back in the train, Ella and Jen dropped to the ground, shrieking, hands thrown up to ward off invisible terror. Light spilled into their eyes and mouths as dream energy swirled around them, assaulting them in a colorful blur of light and sound. Above them, the cop helicopter tailing the train slewed wildly to one side, as an explosion of light beamed out of every window. Inside the carriage, Freddy and Jacob stood frozen, enveloped in a shimmering heat haze, as though time itself had stopped. Kruger's hand moved forward, infinitesimally slowly, creeping toward Jacob's jugular. In Freddy's head, Jacob fell to his knees, exhausted. He looked up with dimming eyes and gasped with relief. It had worked. Every door in the cavern hung wide open, and in every doorway, Freddy had taken the place of each of his victims. Their souls streamed out of the doors in a tsunami-like wave of bluish-white light, vanishing into the walls and roof. 1,000 ungodly shrieks filled the room as Freddy was hung, impaled, burned, electrocuted, dying 1,000 times over in every way imaginable, all in one moment. This was Freddy's worst nightmare come true, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. Jacob punched the air triumphantly. "See how you like it, you son of a bitch!" Moments later, the cavern shook, flooding with a deathly red light. Jacob looked around him in alarm. If Freddy was dying with Jacob inside his mind, he had a very strong feeling that it would be the end of him as well. Time to go. He staggered to his feet, bone-weary, and began running back to the doorway, to where his mother was imprisoned, hanging. He couldn't leave without making sure that she was free, like the rest of the tormented souls in Freddy's twisted world. She might be already dead, but he couldn't bear the thought of her suffering any further. Bitter tears ran down his face at the thought of everything she had already gone through. If only he'd known. Jacob skidded to a halt beside the door and peered feverishly inside, but his mother had gone, and in her place, a burning and extremely pissed Freddy hung on the flaming spike, his black skin carpeted in biting ants. Seeing Jacob, Freddy's nostrils flared, and his fists clenched in hatred. He reared up on the spike with a furious howl of rage, the ants falling away to reveal his pitted, chewed flesh. "Jacob!" Kruger screamed. Crack! The spike splinted under his weight, snapping in half with a sound like a gunshot. Freddy hit the ground with a thud, then pushed himself up and began crawling toward Jacob. Jacob shrank from the appalling sight, then turned and fled, his bare feet slapping on the floor as he put as much distance between himself and Freddy as possible. He passed the door of his own designated fate. It was hanging open, so he couldn't resist sneaking just a little peek inside. It was filled with a milky white light, its depths dwindling to vanishing point. There was nothing that seemed dangerous in there, so Jacob hung back, as the screams from the cavern behind him grew louder. Freddy had told him to choose his own fate, but there was nothing inside the door. Could it be his way out? A sharp pain shot up his leg. Jacob yelped in pain and panic. He stared downward to see the battered form of Freddy clinging to him, reaching out one flaming insect-covered hand. "Look what you've done to me!" Freddy shouted, his face bestial with insane rage. His eyes were spinning black holes in his face, and flames belched out of his mouth as he spoke. "You're gonna pay for this!" With a shudder of revulsion, Jacob drove his heel downward into Freddy's hideous face, shattering his nose and sending blood spraying across the floor at his feet. Freddy let go with a howl, pitching backward onto the floor, and exploded in a shower of blood and crawling black insects that coalesced upward in a spinning black spiral, howling like the spirits of the dead. A loud wail rose from behind him. Turning, Jacob saw that the entire cavern was filled with copies of Freddy, each one more mutilated and twisted than the next. More were jumping down from the walls as they used their supernatural strength to free themselves from the doorways of their fates. They started to close in on him, growling and screaming, their finger knives a weaving forest of silver death. Well, that takes care of that decision, Jacob thought. He started toward his own door, then shrank back as a roaring wall of flame suddenly sprang up, blocking his path. Jacob hesitated. Then, as the shouting voices behind him grew louder, he hardened his resolve and ran toward the open doorway as fast as he could. Bolstering up his nerve, Jacob leapt into the flames. Epilogue. Jacob woke up to the smell of fresh coffee brewing. The delicious scent crept into his nostrils and roused his sleepy brain, bringing with it the promise of breakfast and a morning shower. He felt warm and woozy, and his throat was dry from sleep. He licked his lips and coughed lightly, nestling his sleepy head deeper into the soft, fragment-smelling pillow. The start of yet another day at Weston Hills. Great. His head felt fuzzy, as though the inside of his brain was stuffed with scratchy straw. He put it down to whatever drugs the supervisor had pumped him full of last night. He never knew what new experimental chemical he was going to get, and some mornings he was relieved to wake up at all. But last night, what the hell happened last night? The thought lurked in the back of his brain, nagging at him. Jacob frowned sleepily, and then tried to roll over. He couldn't move. Oh, that one was never good. Tentatively, he opened his eyes. The white ceiling above him swam into focus, the blades of a brushed steel fan turning lazily. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Jacob's eyes tracked downward. He was in what looked like a hospital room. A gurney sat at the end of his bed, and by his side a cardio monitor bleeped reassuringly. There was a big basket of fruit beside him, a bunch of slightly wilting yellow flowers in a vase on the windowsill. A big black folder hung from the end of his bed. Jacob stared at it, fighting down panic. He had no memory of how he had got here. What the hell had happened to him? Why was he in the hospital? Hardly daring to look, Jacob peeped down at himself. Almost every inch of him was swathed in mummy-like rolls of white bandages. There was a 2-inch gap on the inside of his right wrist, where an IV drip was taped to a vein in his arm. The flesh beneath was burned to a crisp, leaking clear fluids into the hospital sheets. But somehow he felt no pain. His eyes followed the snaking line of the IV tubing, and he saw a morphine drip, feeding him elephant-strength painkillers. With each movement, a burning, queasy feeling stabbed through him that made it very clear that, The moment that drip was unhooked, he wasn't going to get any sleep in a long, long time. Given the circumstances, perhaps this wouldn't be such a bad thing. The sensation of burning unlocked a door in his mind, and a memory hit him like a sledgehammer blow to the temple. Freddy, the train, the blood, the Death Stone, Cain, his mother. Jacob's heart started pounding uncontrollably, and he struggled to sit up in the bed, but couldn't move an inch. What had happened to him? Had he beaten Freddy? And what about Ella? Did she make it out, or was she dead too? His heart rate monitor sped up as panic washed through him, and after a moment a nurse in a pale green uniform poked her head through the door at the sound, then broke into a wide smile. "He's awake," she called. The door banged closed, then was pushed open again as Ella walked into the room, followed a moment later by Henry. Jacob sagged in relief, flopping back onto the pillow. Ella looked pale and anxious, in contrast to Henry, who swaggered in like he owned the place. He plopped himself down on a chair by the bed, then started reading through Jacob's patient files, a look of interest on his face. Both his hands were bandaged. "Hospitals suck, dude," he announced to no one in particular. "They make me miss South Park." Ella walked over to Jacob's bed and gazed down at him. "Hey," she said, almost shyly. She was wearing a pink sweater and artfully ripped blue jeans, and looked like she had spent a long time doing her makeup. There was a healing yellow bruise on one cheek. "Welcome back to the world. They didn't think you were going to make it." "Yeah, well," Jacob's voice was a rusty croak, only just audible. "Takes more than an undead maniacal serial killer to get me down, you know." He tried to smile, wincing as his burned lips cracked. "Most days, that is." Ella smiled back at him. Her expression turned serious as she leaned in close. "He's definitely dead, right?" she asked, throwing a worried glance up at the security camera blinking red in the corner of the room. "You tell me. What did y'all see?" He was about to stab you, then he just vanished. He blinked out of existence as though he were never there in the first place. Then you burst into flames. It was horrible, Jacob." Ella smoothed down the blanket beneath her, staring at the coverlet as she replayed the scene in her mind. "If it hadn't been for the fire extinguisher, I don't think you would have made it this far." "So I owe you my life." Ella waved a hand dismissively. "We'll just call it even. Although," she looked up and her eyes met Jacob's with a hint of a challenge. "When you get out of here, you're buying me a drink." "I am?" "You are. I am very traumatized by all of this, you know. I'm going to be having bad dreams for a month." "So you're dreaming again?" "Oh my God, you would not believe how many dreams I've had this week. And they're all so vivid. Yesterday I had this one dream where leprechauns were trying to steal my cheese, and then this guy came in on a purple boat wearing a hat made out of scrambled eggs. Then he was after my cheese too." Jacob smiled as she rambled on, watching the way the sunlight hit her face. He thought she was quite beautiful. Then a thought hit him, and he quickly sobered up. "Your friend, the brunette," he said, when Ella stopped for air. "Is she dead?" "Yes." Ella swallowed hard, avoiding Jacob's gaze. "And her name was Jen. She saved you. The silly little bitch. Probably the one selfless thing she's done in her entire life. I have no idea why." Henry snorted a laugh, and Ella glared at him, then back at Jacob. "Sorry, I didn't mean it like that." "Don't worry about it. I'm really sorry about your friend." Jacob paused. "How did you manage to stop the train?" "Oh, we didn't. The train crashed and we all died," said Henry, his expression deadpan. "You're dreaming this." "Don't even say things like that," Jacob said with a shudder. "Yeah? Well, when you killed Freddy, the snake turned back into a handle and I stopped the train. All by myself. Kinda. I'm really clever." Henry puffed up his chest, looking for all the world like a dog that wanted to be petted. "I got to ride home in the helicopter and everything. And there was this one real cute lady cop who," Jacob frowned. "There was a snake?" "Dude, don't even go there," said Ella. "He's been trying to explain it to me for days. Just step away from the topic and smile and nod." "Fine. I'm just glad that you're both safe." Jacob turned his attention to Henry, who was buried nose deep in the fruit basket beside the bed, picking out all the fresh grapes. "Both of you." "What?" said Henry, stuffing grapes into his mouth. "Oh, yeah, whatever, man." At that moment, the door opened again, and Sheriff Williams walked in. He looked stressed, ill at ease, and his usually crisp uniform looked like it hadn't been ironed for days. "Morning, all," he said, his steely gaze locked in on Jacob. "So tell me, is it something personal, or do you kids just enjoy making paperwork for everyone you meet?" Ella's expression turned to one of concern. "What's up? You need our autographs on any more forms?" "No, thanks. You've done enough for 1 week." Jacob looked guilty. "So," he said, "exactly how much trouble am I in this time?" The sheriff was busily browsing through Jacob's patient notes. "None at all. In fact, you're free to go." "You're kidding me." Jacob's mouth dropped open. "Not at all." The sheriff reached up and changed Jacob's IV drip for him. "We looked into this Kane guy, uncovered a paper trail as long as the Mississippi. Seems like he's been messing with all kinds of things an ex-cop shouldn't mess with. Fraud, identity theft, kidnapping, and bribing a whole bunch of high-up people to cover up for him. An investigation is being launched by our own police department. I personally believe everyone involved will be fired." "Glad to hear it," said Ella. "It's always nice to save the day." "That's what we're here for." The sheriff gave Ella a small, stiff bow. "Hey, I was wondering whether I can have a word with the patient." "Sure." The sheriff paused. "I mean, alone." "Oh, right. We'll be outside." Ella paused, then leaned over Jacob and gave him a quick kiss on his heavily bandaged cheek. Jacob winced, then smiled ruefully. "And they say love hurts." "Don't get any ideas now." Ella wagged her finger, then winked at him, and walked out of the door. Henry followed her, widening his eyes and giving Jacob an exasperated look, drawing his hand sharply across his throat. Jacob smiled to himself. He gave a lazy yawn, fighting the urge to stretch, which he was sure would only bring him more pain. "So, when can I get out of here?" "Out?" The sheriff smiled blandly. "Oh, you can't get out. That's what maximum security wards are for." "Maximum?" Jacob's smile froze on his face. "But you said—" "I lied," said the sheriff smoothly. "None of you are leaving. You're too much of a liability." All the color drained out of Jacob's face. From outside he heard shouting, and there was the sound of a brief scuffle that ended with the clink of metal and a door slamming. He stared up at Sheriff Williams, unbelieving, then swung his gaze around the room. For the first time he noticed the bars on the window, the clamps on the side of the bed, the lack of sharp objects or door handles. The world closed in on him. He turned his pleading eyes on the sheriff. "But the guys, they did nothing wrong." "They know his name," the sheriff said stiffly. "That's enough to bring him back. We can't risk that. Not again." He tossed Jacob's patient files down onto the end of his bed. "Their parents will be informed they aided and abetted a known teenage felon, a sociopath with severe mental health problems. I'm sure they'll only be too anxious for their kids to receive the kind of psychiatric rehabilitation they need, courtesy of the world-class team we have up at Weston Hills." Above them the fan blades creaked, turning slowly and heavily. Squeak, squeak, squeak. "You asshole!" Jacob shouted. "You know it was Freddy!" "Frederick Krueger is dead," said the sheriff, as though reading from an invisible auto cue. Above them the red light on the security camera blinked, coldly recording them through its dead glass eye. "He died over a decade ago. You're quite clearly suffering from hallucinogenic psychosis brought on by illegal drug usage, a poor upbringing, and possible malnutrition in early childhood." He stuffed Jacob's case notes back into his file as the boy stared at him horrified. "The whole of Springwood Police Department wishes you a safe and speedy recovery. Have a nice day, Jacob." With that, the sheriff turned on his heel and strode from the room, locking the door behind him. Jacob stared at the closed door, then reeled as a strange sense of numbness flooded over him as the new IV drip kicked in. The world blurred and swam before his eyes as he struggled to focus. The IV was blue and had the remains of a small blue pill drifting around at the bottom. Jacob wound his eyes around frantically and saw a tall jar beside the bed. The label read, Tranquil X. Jacob recognized the brand name. Sleeping pills. No! Jacob's fist clenched. He pulled frantically on the leather restraints that bound him to the bed. He started screaming, yelling for the sheriff, for anyone. His only response was the sound of a metal viewing window sliding firmly shut, and the booted footsteps striding away from the door. Keys jangled, and then silence fell over the room. A moment later there was a loud whoomph, and ghostly flames sprung up around the bed. The smell of burning flesh filled Jacob's nostrils, and then the ward door shivered and melted open. An endless inferno was revealed, stretching to infinity. Jacob looked up at the door, and dread rolled over him in a choking black wave. His own name was inscribed above it, and he realized that this was the very door he had chosen to jump through, into the fire, and into his own very personal hell. "Great choice, kid," rasped a very familiar voice. "Now, how about a little father-son time?" As the raging flames closed in on Jacob, the last thing he heard before drug-induced sleep claimed him was the cackle of maniacal laughter and the sound of metal screeching on metal. He may have saved the day in the real world, but every night, in his dreams, Freddy would have the last laugh. Okay, this has been chapters 16 and 17 and the epilogue, the conclusion of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream. I really loved every aspect of the story, except for the whole mystical Deathstone Kane storyline, but everything else I really digged. I really thought that Natasha Rhodes really captured the essence of Freddy and Freddy's dreamscape, and the way she shaped these nightmares was amazing. So I got to give her mad props for that, for sure. But like I said, I didn't really care for the Kane magical Deathstone thing. Although that was a pretty cool fight scene. The stuff they were throwing at each other was pretty neat. And I do think the ending was a lot like the movies. You think that the heroes have won the day and everything's a happy ending. Then bam, Freddy's back in, and it ends in kind of a cliffhanger way. And they're back in Freddy's realm. And that's exactly what happened here. I don't like the fact that Jacob's mom is dead in this storyline, because she fought Freddy so hard, in 3, 4, and 5. And for her to just be dead now like this kind of disappointed me. But that's enough about what I think, guys. I want to hear what you thought of this book, what you thought of the story, the characters, the beginning, the middle, the end. I want to hear it all. So in the comments section, let me know what you thought of this book. Guys, I'll be moving on to the movie novelization of Jason X. That'll be the next book I start narrating. The novelization of the movie Jason X. I'm looking forward to that. Okay, guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!